Hi, and welcome to this session of our EpiDoc training program, for which you can see a link at the bottom of the screen. So here it is. And in this session, Gabriel Vodar is going to talk about how to encode bibliography in EpiDoc. So please, Gabby, up to you.
Great, thank you, Irene. Yes, so there's a couple of different things we want to think about when encoding bibliography in an EpiDoc corpus or in a digital corpus generally. The first is the very common need to have a master bibliography for the corpus that is referred to from other parts of the corpus, from individual EpiDoc files and so forth. And then the second is to have what the bibliographical references in the individual EpiDoc files look like, and what information they need to contain, what relationship they have to the corpus bibliography, and what sorts of bibliography or bibliographies you might include in there. When you're specifically talking about bibliographies of previous editions, there's one particular thing that you need to be able to encode, but there's other kinds of bibliography that you might want to treat in slightly different ways, and that might or might not have reference to a corpus bibliography. And then, which we've discussed a little bit in the past already, but I'll recap slightly, there's the issue of citing bibliography in the apparatus criticus and in other parts of your EpiDoc file. So the corpus bibliography first. The corpus bibliography is effectively, it's an authority list of the kind that that we've talked about in previous presentations in this series. In exactly the same way as any other authority list, it is made up of a list, and very often, as you will recall, these elements actually are, the element name is list something. In this case, it's list bibble, and it's made up of a list, and the individual items, the individual bibliographical items in this case in that list, each has an XML identifier, the XML ID attribute, to which you can point for normalization or disambiguation from your individual files. So it is in that sense, it is an authority list. The individual items in that authority list will be bibliographical references as given here. So it's not just an element, it's the full bibliographical reference. It's not just a shorthand, it gives you the full information, and you can encode all sorts of information within that bibliographical reference if you think it's useful to do so. Usually the value in encoding lots and lots of information in these in a bibliographical reference like this is if you want to be able to treat those things in different ways, if you want to be able to index them or sort them in different ways, or if you want to display your bibliography following different conventions, and so forth. But so in this case, I've for the example, I've encoded almost everything in there, although you note that I'm still treating this as a running text, not as a database entry, because there are, for example, between the elements, there are things like this comma, this and, this period. If I wanted parentheses around the date, I would put them around the date rather than leaving them there. So in this example, it's a running text bibliographical reference, for which much of this markup may not be entirely necessary. So marking up the title level equals J, the journal title there, is useful because that's a title that we want to put in italics. Marking the title level A, the analytic title, the article title, is useful because that in the standard convention that I use at any rate, we'd want to put in inverted commas, but not everyone's convention might be the same. And tagging the author's names is useful because, and the date is useful because those are pieces of information that you might want to use in places where you cite or index this, so as part of the short title for this bibliography, this bibliographical reference. Things like the biblioscope for the volume and for the pages may not be quite as useful to tag. If you're not going to use them for anything, why tag them 1,000 times in your corpus when you're not using them? But that's something for you to decide. And the one other thing that it can be useful to tag, and I've added to this slide, is specifying which part of the author name is the surname. That may sound obvious, but if I wanted to abbreviate this in my concordance or in my apparatus criticus, for example, as Abdus Salam 1997 or Abdus Salam et al. 1997, the computer would have to be able to grab Abdus Salam from this bibliographical entry. And so tagging the surname explicitly might be a useful thing to do. And you might want to tag all of the surnames in here. I've only tagged the first one for the sake of the example. So you make various decisions in how you encode your corpus bibliography, and then in the individual EpiDoc file, you have a slightly different kind of bibliography. What you have in here is you have your div type bibliography, which again has a list bibble, and it has various bibliographical entries in it. But instead of having XML identifiers on the bibble element, what it has is it points to, using this element PTR, which means pointer, it points to the corpus bibliography by pointing to those XML IDs that we've talked about, and you'll recognize these short references that begin with the hash character that refers to an XML ID. And because that's in a different file, we would probably want to include the file name in here eventually. But for the purposes of keeping this simple, perhaps while editing, I've left those out. And so I'm saying effectively this EpiDoc file, the papyrus or inscription that I'm editing in this file, has previously been edited in the following 3 places. Okay, and each of these, at the very minimum, needs a pointer to say this is where it has been previously edited. The other thing that's really useful, in addition to that pointer, is a cited range. Some papyri or inscriptions will have been published in a previous publication where that is the only thing that previous publication did was publish this particular text. But in many of them will be published, Abdus Salam 1997 published several inscriptions, and number 1 is the one that I'm talking about in my EpiDoc edition here. So so I specifically say cited range to say which one. SEG, the cited ranges, I'm specifically talking about SEG volume 47, number 2200. So the cited range is what enables me to index these bibliographical references and create a bibliographical concordance of, for example, all of the inscriptions in Abdus Salam 1997 to get that that information out. So the absolutely bare minimum you need is a bibliographical reference with a pointer and usually a cited range in this way. You may find it useful, even if it's a corpus that only ever mentions one inscription or one piece of papyrological edition, to still have a cited range, just for uniformity across your corpus. But that's something your whoever's writing your process will have to tell you whether that's necessary or not. You may, however, for purposes of either display in your local file, if you display it using running text rather than going to the corpus bibliography and grabbing that information to print in your individual EpiDoc edition, you may also want to include some other information in here, not tagged, but just to be printed, because the pointer on its own is just an empty element. It won't appear in your HTML file. It won't appear in your PDF. It'll just disappear unless you write something to say, go and grab the surname and date and some other information in order to print in each file. And bear in mind, again, that if your EpiDoc file ends up at some point in the future separated from your corpus because someone has reused it, repurposed it, it's been released under Creative Commons license and it's being built on in some other context, and all you had in your bibliography was this information, they don't have your corpus bibliography to hand, so they don't know what hash Abdus Salam 1997 means, especially if instead of using a string which we can sort of deconstruct into an author date bibliographical reference, it used an arbitrary string such as Bibble 9304. No one would necessarily be able to find that information very easily. So having a bit more information there just as text, perhaps you want to display it in a particular way, perhaps you want to cite this as Abdus Salam Reynolds 1997, despite the fact that there are 3 authors named in the full bibliographical item, you can choose that sort of thing. And in the second bibliographical item here, we say whence at the beginning to make clear that this is a derived bibliographical reference, not the primary publication. So that's things you can add to your text. Another model that I have seen used quite a bit, and this is especially useful again with those arbitrary strings, not Abdusalam 1997, but Bibble 123, is to have an XML comment. You see the angle bracket exclamation mark dash dash, and then the ends with dash dash angle bracket. That tells you it's an XML comment. This is useful to be read by someone looking at the XML, but it will never be processed, it'll never be transformed, and it will not be kept in any HTML that's produced from this. So it is not really there, but it's useful there just to remind yourself what's going on. So if you need to remember what bibliographical item 123 is, having Abdusalam Reynolds 1997 out in text there in the comment can be a useful reminder of that, can be handy. In this case, it looks a little bit redundant because it's just telling you what's already there in the target, and SEG, where the target is SEG, is a bit redundant, but it can be a useful way to handle your bibliography in that way. So far we've seen the bibliography of previous editions of the text. You can, if you want, have multiple bibliographies in each papyrus in your corpus, for example. So in this case, you might have one bibliography of editions, and so we could use, div type equals bibliography is the constrained value that you need for your bibliography to be in, but then you can have a subtype to subclassify that in any way you like. You could have the sub-bibliography of editions, another bibliography of discussions, another bibliography of photographs, of translations, any other kinds of bibliographies you can imagine. It's useful to do this if you're going to be consistent across your corpus in doing it, but that's the sort of thing you can do. And again, you might treat these slightly differently. The bibliography of discussion and of photographs, you might not want to tag in the same way as the editions, because they may not be in your corpus bibliography. If one text in your entire corpus is discussed in some article somewhere, it might not be worth putting that in your corpus bibliography. You might only put that in the bibliography for this file. So you tag it differently. It wouldn't point to the corpus bibliography. It would have the full reference here instead. And you might not be interested in generating a concordance of people who discuss this inscription. If they don't give the inscription a number, they're not considered a previous publication of it. And so concordance might look something like this, maybe with slightly more regular handling of the numbers, because I noticed this concordance after I made the screenshot has a couple of those things seem to be broken. 170 and 171 and 357 should each be treated as separate inscriptions, not all grouped together. But leaving aside that error, you can generate a concordance. So going sort of backwards from your inscription, rather than all of the previous editions of this inscription, let's look at one previous publication and look at all the inscriptions that they number in that, and what do we call them in our corpus. So and this is generated in exactly the same way that an index is generated in other contexts. And finally, we've already talked about this in another presentation, so I'm not going to talk about this in great detail. That XML identifier, the XML ID attribute, can also be pointed to from other places in the corpus, such as the apparatus, but also potentially commentary, translation, and other places. And it points to from a source attribute, and it says, this reading, Eul, was the reading of Ferry 1922. Okay, so whatever reading we give for this is the previous reading of that in section 1, line 5 on there. And with other kinds of reference to the bibliography from outside of the bibliographical part of the edition, you can use this source attribute to point to bibliography at any point and say, this is where I've got this information from. You can do that in, for example, you tag the dimensions, you can say source equals, and you can say, I didn't make these measurements, it was Ferry 1922 who made these measurements and published them, and I'm reprinting them here. That XML ID could point to the corpus bibliography, or it could point to an ID in your individual EpiDoc file, depending on how you decided to structure that information. And by using that ID, you potentially give the processor information that they can get from the source of that ID. They could get surname and date, or short title, or some other way of identifying that piece of bibliography in a human readable way to print into the note in your apparatus or in wherever else in your corpus it is. You could use that tagging to generate historical editions. If you consider this as parallel segmentation, you could say, well, show me what this corpus, this particular text looked like when published by Abdusalam with all the differences from my edition. Or you could use those to create tooltips or pop-ups or some other way of making the apparatus criticus more readable than traditional apparatus criticus are. And so to go back to my first point, the corpus bibliography is an authority list. The items in it have an XML identifier. They can be pointed to from your individual EpiDoc files. Those pointers can be used to generate an index, and we usually call that a bibliographical concordance, but in some disciplines that might have a different name. And it could also be used to display information, to filter your corpus, to create searches, or to create historical editions by filtering by bibliography or by date or similar. That's, I think, about all I have to say. Anything you would add, Irene?
No, it was great.
Cool, thank you.
Perfect.